introduction, I'm David Allen. I'm the Executive Director for CECA Southern, and I'm here to introduce both this webinar and Richard Patterson, who will be telling us all about the NEC4 X29 climate change secondary clause. This is just part of CECA's ongoing work aligned to our CECA 4 pillars that are on the screen. You can see at the on the intro screen there. And that include the sharing of awareness and upskilling of our members and the wider industry, particularly around sustainability. However, just before I introduce Richard more formally, I'd like to refresh or update your awareness about what CECA is and what it does for your organisations and industry. The Civil Engineering Contractors Association is a trade body that represents and promotes the interests of over 300 organisations who deliver about 80% of the civil engineering infrastructure work on mainland UK. Next slide, please. And CECA is made up of 6 English regions, 2 devolved nations and a national team in London. And this event today is being delivered for all CECA members. CECA creates a window across our industry and engages on your behalf with government and public bodies at a national, subnational and regional level, as well as with key clients in both the public and private sectors and other industry bodies. We look to ensure that your voice is heard. We work with and support the Construction Leadership Council on their work streams as part of this process. We also support initiatives that look to develop a more sustainable industry and promote the training and development required for industry to align with this. And today's webinar is a great way of combining these 2 ambitions. You can find more details about CECA on our website and in our weekly updates, but now back to this meeting. In terms of housekeeping, we should be already recording this session, just so you're aware of that, and that will then help us be able to cascade the awareness that comes out of it a bit further and a bit wider. We invite questions at any relevant point during the presentation, but please raise your hand and wait to be invited to ask that question. Or equally, you can put something in the chat box and we will keep an eye on that and raise that accordingly with Richard. The webinar will be made publicly available and we will send out links to the attendees and include them on our website and on LinkedIn so that you will always be able to get back to it. So now for a bit about Richard, who I first met at the NEC People's Conference, where he delivered a very passionate and informed series of updates about the use of the NEC4, amongst other things. And I decided then that he had to come and talk to you all. A chartered civil engineer, fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and a procurement and NEC specialist. He has been with the global development, engineering and management consultant, Mott MacDonald, for over 35 years, and we thank them for his time and support here today. Richard was part of the drafting team for the NEC4, part of the ICE's working group on procurement, contracts, carbon and net zero, and was one of the 4-person team that developed the NEC's recently released secondary option X29 climate change. Richard leads on the NEC for Mott MacDonald and delivers in-house and client training, as well as training for the NEC. He is very keen on getting NEC used more widely and has given NEC training across the world in pursuit of this aim, including presentations done in Singapore. He has contributed to 2 NEC books, had 7 NEC papers published in the ICE's proceedings, and sat on the editorial advisory panel of the ICE's journal, Management, Procurement and Law. He is also a frequent contributor to the NEC website and the newsletter, and we are pleased to have him with us today. So over to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for the length of the bio. It's far too much detail. I describe myself as a sad NEC nerd, but I'm quite happy to be an NEC nerd because it keeps me going and it pays the mortgage. So I am particularly passionate about X29. As David has said, I was part of the team that developed it, and I really, really want to see you guys using it and making a difference with it. That's why I'm here today. We have to put that in. That's my slide. We've already talked about that. That is not what we're talking about today. That is the X29. Apparently it was quite a successful little plane, but didn't go too far. I'm hoping that our X29 will have a longer lifespan. I love that slide. We all want to save the world. I work in Mott MacDonald. I've been there for 35 years. We are a serious company. We like to do good stuff, and we have a whole load of people wanting to do carbon reduction. The whole world is trying to reduce the carbon impact of our projects, and that's one reason why this secondary option came about, as you'll see. But it won't, contracts on their own don't do nothing. They have to be done and used by people like you to try and actually make a difference. So that's why we're here. So this presentation has got nothing to do with PAS 2080, apart from the fact that I'm hoping most people on the call will have at least heard of PAS 2080. This is a internationally recognized framework for decarbonising buildings and structures and infrastructure generally. So this has been updated very recently. Again, my colleague Maria Manidaki led the team developing this. I think it was Mott and Arups worked together on PAS 2080, and it's a very good high-level structure for getting people to think about carbon. But when we get down to the contracts level, I want to give you X29. So history, as was mentioned, it started out as an ICE carbon group, and then X29 was developed by a little team led by Ian Heafy, friend of mine, who's an NEC board member, including myself and a couple of others. Draft was published in April. This is 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, and was actually published in July 2022. There's versions and guide notes for all of the NEC big contracts, not the short contracts. So all of it's out there, all of it's freely available. I think the next slide is going to have a link on it to go and get those documents. But the focus today, unsurprisingly, is going to be on the words in the engineering and construction contract. That's the big one. That's the one that's used broadly and widely for infrastructure in the UK. So there you go. There's links for you. There's just 3 pages of the document, and there's 5 pages of guidance. It's not going to take you a long time to read. I hope this presentation will make you interested enough to go and have a look and start trying to think about this properly. So what have we got? Fundamentally, I should warn you, this presentation won't take much more than half an hour. So we'll have hopefully lots of time for questions. Fundamentally, there's 2 things in X29. There's climate change requirements, and then there's a performance table. And guess what? I'm going to do them in that order. Climate change requirements. We've got the scope. The scope is the document in all NEC contracts which tells the contractor what we want. It defines the works, which is the thing that's left behind, and it can also include constraints on how the contractor provides the works. And the climate change requirements, capital letter defined term, are included within the scope, as we can see from the picture, and obviously they're nicely green. And that's all it says. The climate change requirements are the requirements related to climate change stated in the scope. That's quite simple, isn't it? And my 10-year-old could read that. That's very simple. And to be honest, that doesn't actually change anything, because for the last 20 years, we could have included climate change requirements, lowercase, in the scope, and they required the contractor to do them. Sometimes, potentially, those of you that know your NEC will know there's an opportunity for the client to ask a bidder for scope provided by the contractor for its design. In some scenarios, we might be getting some more climate change requirements offered from the bidder. Unlikely, but possible. So NEC's guidance, I've just cut and stuck a few lines from the guidance note. It could include this sort of stuff. Levels of recycling, renewable power, trendy, isn't it? Electric vehicles. We've got electric cranes, for heaven's sake. It's all radical. Reducing waste and so on. Anything that we think could be a climate change requirement, we can put that in our contract. When you're doing that, though, think about risk. Make sure you're not putting unduly onerous obligations in the contract. Otherwise, of course, ultimately the bidders will overprice them, or maybe they'll just walk away and not bid at all. So if we have a climate change requirements in the scope, if it relates to the works, now the works is I always say in training, the thing what's left behind. In the old fashioned language, we used to call that the permanent works. If there's a non-compliance with a climate change requirement, that's a non-compliance with a requirement in the scope, and the supervisor will notify a defect. The contractor, like any other defect, is required to correct that defect within the italics defect correction period. Everybody in this room today will tell you that it's in italics. It's in the contract data, they will say. It's just a period stated in the contract data. There's an option in the contract for the contractor to propose to not change the defect, to have that defect accepted by the project manager. That's subject normally to the contractor offering a slight reduction in prices and or an earlier completion date. If that's not done, and if the defect is not corrected within the defect correction period, then the PM has a clause 46. The PM can assess the cost of having that defect corrected, and the contract just says the contractor pays. The contractor doesn't just get out their wallet and hand over some tenors. What that means is that will get picked up, that amount will get as a negative amount in the next assessment for payment. This is just a normal defect in an ECC contract. So that would be the case, for example, if we just said we wanted low energy light bulbs. If contractor puts in high energy light bulbs, notify a defect, go and change the light bulbs. Nice and simple. On the other hand, if the non-compliance, if the climate change requirements is not relating directly to the works in italics, it's not the thing that's being built. If the climate change requirement says you're not allowed to use diesel cranes, that's a constraint on how the contractor provides the works. If the contractor starts using diesel cranes, that's not a defect, because a defect is only the works. It's not a defect, but the PM can just stop the job and say, well, not stop the whole job, but stop that part of the job. Excuse me, Mr. Contractor, you're supposed to be using electric cranes. PM can stop the job until the electric cranes come on site, and the contractor will get nothing for that. Normally, a stop the job instruction from the PM would be a compensation event, but clause 61.2, I am a sad NEC nerd, says that the contractor will not get any money for a fault, which is, for a compensation event, which is caused by a fault of the contractor. So that's how we're going to deal with defects in this thing. Now, the actual clauses in the contract, there's a little bit more detail. NEC introduces the idea of climate change partners. These are other people who contribute to the achievement of these climate change requirements, and they're identified in the climate change requirements. This is standard NEC language, so this is prompting the drafter of the document to think about other elements, to think about other partners that are part of reducing the climate or helping meet these climate change requirements. And again, the contractor has an obligation to collaborate with those partners as stated in the climate change requirements. And lastly, there's another document created by X29, which is called a climate change plan. And this is just, and it says, this is straight out of the contract, shows how the contractor plans to meet the climate change requirements. Very simple. And again, lastly, the climate change plan has to comply with any details we've said about it in the climate change requirements. All very simple, clear, hopefully plain language. Now, to be honest, the climate change plan, it doesn't do anything other than create a document which requires the contractor to tell us what they're doing in relation to these requirements. So what it does do is put the onus on the contractor to have at least one person in their team who cares about these things and will develop this so-called climate change plan. Also, when we put this document together, we added this clause: the parties may use, disclose and publicize information for the purposes in and for the purposes stated again in the climate change requirements. So what the world is trying to do is get the world to share how this whole process is happening. And that was the intention of that clause, so that the client, when they write the climate change requirements, can say you are required to share what's happening. Climate change plan, again, shows how the contractor plans to meet the requirements. It can be submitted in advance by the bidder and pointed to from the contract data. Those of you know your NEC will know that's exactly the same process with the programme. It can be done that, or it can be submitted after award within a stated period of the contract data. That's exactly the same as a programme in NEC. It's revised whenever instructed to by the PM or whenever the contractor chooses. It's got to be accepted within 2 weeks, or reasons, or the PM states reasons for not accepting. And again, as I mentioned before, the climate change plan might include, the climate change requirements might include specific things about the climate change plan. And one of the reasons for not accepting it is if it doesn't comply with those stated requirements. All very simple. We chose not to include this climate change plan in the compensation event process. We're trying to keep it simple. So generally, I would say that the climate change plan is a fairly light touch. Like I say, think of it as an obligation to have a document which shows the contractor is at least thinking about these climate change requirements. Deep breath, that was the easy bit. This, though, is, to my mind, by far the more important part, the performance table. Now, when we wrote this, some of you will know NEC, some of you know that there are other NEC contracts that already had a performance table. It was already, for example, in the Alliance contract. So, again, those of you that know your NEC will know that NEC has an option X17 called performance damages. This is all very negative. We'll take money off you if you don't meet the targets. But we've got X20, which is driven. It's supposed to be positive payments for beating targets. I mentioned that to the people I'm training here in Leatherhead yesterday, and they just laughed at me because they know that most clients tweak it and make it negative, but it's not really supposed to be. So in NEC 3 and 4, we've got X17 and X20. What the performance table, so effectively we've got damages and bonuses. I can't resist saying it. I know this is being recorded, but I like to call them slaps and tickles, but I was told that I can't really call them tickles. So I've got people laughing at me in the back. I'm going to try and make NEC interesting, okay? So we've got damages or bonuses. That's the professional thing to say. I'm sorry, anybody else. And the performance table, what does it look like? In the contract data, in X29, I'll be honest, Richard Patterson wanted the performance table to be included in the document. Instead, it's only included in the guidance document. So go and find that guidance and then construct your own performance table. But it's likely to include the following columns. Subject, the target. Now, I say that very quickly. Target is easy to say. But particularly if we start putting money against that target, the target is going to need detailed and robust measurement rules. Units, when are we going to measure the performance? And then, very simple words, how much is the contractor going to pay to the client if the performance does not meet the target? Okay, and then common sense, we have a column for a limit on the amount paid, because if the bidder is bidding this job, as we know, you certainly know if you're a contractor, you need to have your liability limited. And I'll say it now, it comes up on the slide later, but the liability to pay money under X29 is not, repeat, not covered by limits on liability in X18. Specifically, it was intended not to be, so that clients can think about and should put in an appropriate limit. So we're talking at this level here, we're talking about putting a limit on this particular payment for this particular target. This is me giving you the total of the columns. hope you've realized that we can have as many rows as you like for as many different targets as you might want to have. That's the red bit. Hang on, we've got a green bit. We're going to be positive. The amount paid to the contractor if performance exceeds or meets the target. Guess what? The client might want to put a limit on that bonus. And lastly, we might want to put in a reporting frequency. So that's what we've said in this X29 should be in the performance table. And I'm hoping you've just realised I haven't said anything about climate. These targets can be for whatever you like. But X29 is called climate change because it's got climate change requirements. And the idea was that we could use these targets to properly incentivize things that matter for saving the planet. Now, it could be just the power consumption of a water treatment plant. So when you bid your tender document, you get the contractor to promise what the power consumption will be. If it turns out to be worse than they promised, they pay some money. That's common sense. Or radically, it could be targets for carbon. Oh my word, I think that will come later. Also in the performance table, I've shown you we've got limits for individual amounts, but we've also got limits in the performance table for the overall amount to be paid by or paid to the contractor for the sum or the total of all of the different targets that we've set out in our performance table. These targets could be set directly by the client in the tender document, or they could be offered by the bidder. Now, if they're being offered by the bidder, you could then include those offers in your tender evaluation. The easiest one to think about there, again, is the Richard Patterson example of a water treatment plant, which I do for a living. So we get a capital price, the prices, but we also might ask the bidder to give us our power consumption. Then our tender evaluation puts that through a model, including, say, 30 years of power consumption as promised by the contractor. And then we can award the contract based on whoever gives us the lowest whole life cost. Isn't that radical? You civil engineers out there, you're trying to save the world. How about we start by choosing based on the best whole life cost rather than just the best capital cost? That'd be a good start, wouldn't it? Radical idea. That performance table is in italics, therefore it's in the contract data. And if there is some elements of that to be filled in by the bidder, then those of you who know we're NEC will say we'll have it in contract data part 2 rather than part 1. It doesn't matter, it just needs to end up in the contract data. As I mentioned, there's an example of that performance table set out for you in the guide notes. It's all really quite simple, I hope. This is the words. Contractors got to give us reports on performance intervals stated in the performance table. That's the key clause for paying money or getting money for their performance either not meeting or beating the targets. And it's just in one simple clause, nice and simple, as you'd expect from NEC. Critically, information in this performance table is not scope. If it was scope and it wasn't delivered, then that would be a defect and we'd have a second way of slapping the contractor. So it's not scope, it's just dealt with as a target with positive and or negative money against that target. And as I mentioned earlier, in NEC language, X29 is an excluded matter. An excluded matter means the amounts, the liability of it is not covered by the limits of liability if you've included X18. Hope that's clear. And if we've got any questions, David, any questions coming in yet? Don't be shy to stop me. Okay, I've already mentioned this. We could have targets for things affecting whole life cost. In my world, my water treatment plant, I'm doing this in Bangladesh, sadly, with a... Yeah, please.
Hi, Richard. I'll just interrupt there if I may. I mean,
yeah.
You've spoken about various sort of issues, including the offer from the bidder, from the contractor in sort of procuring the work.
Yeah.
suppose the biggest question is, how does the client sort of value the carbon pound? Because obviously that has to be one of the biggest challenges for contractors procuring, as to know what sort of commitment they can make to it in terms of how it will be assessed during the procurement stage.
Well, that's brilliant. But I'm going to go back to my slides because I'm going to get there on the next slide.
Right.
So
okay.
let me do that. I'm not trying to dodge the question. I'm hoping to do that. But let's stick with the script here. So if we've got whole life cost, the best examples are power and chemicals, but you could apply that to anything that you could test, anything that's going to affect the whole life cost of this asset. As I said, the simplest example is a water treatment plant, which will use power, will use chemicals. The power consumption, the chemical consumption will be dependent on the process and the design provided by the contractor. So we can get the contractor to give us those promises, and then we can assess the bids based on a whole life cost. As in all procurement these days, you would be obliged to give the bidder the exact mechanism as to how you're going to value those promises for power and chemicals. So you'd have to tell the contractor what power cost you're going to use in your calculation, how you're going to sum up the net present cost of maybe 30 years of operating of this asset. So to do that, you put that in your tender evaluation, but then the performance targets are then in the contract effectively to enforce those promises. If the contractor doesn't meet those promises, then they'll get a slap. They'll have to pay the contractor, pay the client some money as a compensation for not being as efficient as they promised. So with money and whole life costs, that's quite simple. Guess what? We like writing articles, so there's a link to an article specifically on that issue, how you can use X29 to achieve lowest whole life cost. Please go and have a read, but I've told you the basics. Now then, as David's question, what about targets for carbon? The first question is, can we measure it? Around the industry, around the world, there are many, many organizations trying to develop standard measures for carbon. One of them is BCIA. I think that gets a mention on a later slide here. There are various people trying to come up with databases for standard ways of measuring carbon. But the issue, and David's point, even if we did have a robust measurement for carbon, and if we asked a contractor to promise us how much carbon they're going to use or not use, when it comes to tender evaluation, as David's alluded to, is a client going to be brave enough or radical enough to start effectively paying for lower uses of carbon? Everybody in the world is saying, oh, it's a great idea, we want to use less carbon. But if you've got two bids and one is 10% cheaper but uses 20% more carbon, which one are you going to choose? You're going to have to set that out in your tender evaluation mechanism. And effectively, you're getting the board of your client effectively to pay for less use of carbon. At the moment in the UK, I'm only aware of one client that's getting close to doing that. And that, as you might expect, is the Environment Agency. Does that answer your question, David? I think it was a really good question at the right point.
It does, yeah. I mean, it does sort of expose a wider challenge, because you've referred to PAS 2080 and how that's really a strategic overview of
PAS 2080 is lovely. Like I say, it's pushing everybody in the right direction. But now I'm a contracts person, so now we're using the contract to encourage people to do the stuff that they've been promising in a nice, fluffy sort of promisey, we're all mates way. So, for example, in the government procurement for the last 10 years has required 10% to be on social value or something like that. Wonderfully fluffy instructions from central government. What we're doing here is saying that 10% is typically based on a point scoring system for tender evaluation. But once the tender's evaluated, it's all done and dusted, and the contractor can do what they flipping well like. Whereas what we're trying to do here is build the promises actually into the contract, into the performance table, and have slaps or tickles to encourage the contractor to actually deliver what they've promised. That's the one I was thinking of. The Built Environment Carbon Database started about October 2023. It's available. It's being freely available, shared around the world. You can access the tool there. That's a Mott MacDonald website. I'm not sure if that's where it's got to. And the quote from that, Mott MacDonald was one of the companies that was one of the first companies to start sharing data with that worldwide database. And the line there, if we're doing it, why can't everybody else do it? That's what James Fisk said. He's the CEO of BCIS. And we're the first people that did that. So I'm quite proud of that my company is trying to lead on this issue. And the idea is that this database will allow the calculation of the embodied carbon in all elements of the project. Now, I'm not sure how far the BCIS database has got to so that's the carbon in the works, the thing that's left behind. I'm not sure how well that treats the carbon used in delivering the project, which is also significant in terms of the carbon usage on your project. So the other point I need to make, I mean, we should do a lot more detail on how to set these targets for carbon. That's not the purpose of today's presentation. I'm afraid if you wanted that, you're not going to get it. What we will do in the follow-up email, I'll send you links to a couple of other presentations I've done on this subject. One included a very good guy from Skanska, sorry, I can't come up with his name off my heart, who told us how they have used this X29. They didn't actually have pain and gain in it. They didn't have slaps and tickles, but the point was made that just measuring these things is starting to move people in the right direction. But the point I'm hoping you've picked up so far is that the performance table is not only for climate change. It's definitely not only for carbon. You can put in there targets for anything that you like, as long as it's important enough for the client to care and it's measurable. So the two examples that are bouncing around the industry at the moment, our industry, are so-called social value, and big one currently, last year or two, biodiversity net gain. So guess what? We've written articles because I like writing articles. I'm a sad NEC person, I might have mentioned. So there's a link there to an article that I wrote with a Mott MacDonald specialist in social value, Karen Dunlop. This was in the New Civil Engineer magazine, very short article. But the point being that if the client wants the contractor to employ apprentices, if you can measure that and put that in as a performance table, you can positively incentivize the contractor to provide the apprentices rather than just getting them to say, yeah, honest gov, I'll do it. And then likewise, biodiversity. Julia Baker is leading the world on biodiversity. She's another colleague of mine, and we put together a very simple article. It's only a couple of pages, if that. Basically, government has set out rules for how to actually measure biodiversity net gain. Therefore, in theory, if client thinks this is important enough, we could build that into those contracts. The point I haven't made, I'm not sure it's on a slide here, it should be, hopefully it's clear, we should only have performance targets for things that can be directly affected by the contractor. And if the contractor is doing design and build, obviously they've got more scope to influence the outturn, whether it's social value or biodiversity net gain. Where do I put my requirements in these two parts of the document I've talked about? If we have stuff in the climate change requirements, and if they need to be changed, then because they're in the scope, they can be unilaterally changed by the PM. But on the other hand, there's no direct commercial incentive. They've got to do it, but there's no direct incentive or subtlety about how much of it they do. And as I mentioned before, the only defects we can properly police are ones that relate to the works, or as I said before, we could stop the job if this climate change requirement relates to how the contractor provides the works, e.g. use the electric cranes. On the other hand, hopefully you've picked up by now, in the performance table, we can have a direct commercial incentive to comply with the things that we put in our performance table. On the con side, they can be changed by compensation events, but otherwise they could only be changed by an agreed addendum, 12.3 in NEC. They can't be unilaterally changed by the project manager. And the con, and the really important con, is that you need to get your team to set out very, very clear measurement rules for anything that you're trying to measure in the performance table. Obviously, if there's no money against it, it can be as fuzzy as you like. But if we're doing it professionally, and particularly if we're trying to put money against it, we need to have those rules very, very explicit. What comes first? I think it's the performance table. I think that's the key gem in X29. And to get anything into the performance table, firstly, it needs to be important enough. Hopefully, those of you out there know that we've gone through a whole history of KPIs, haven't we? Tony Blair wanted to KPI the world, God bless him. Clients have learned that we need to focus on the key ones. Let's not have 30 items in the performance table. Let's have 3. Is it important enough? Is it under the control of the contractor? And then is it measurable? If that's a yes to all those 3, then I can recommend we bother to put it in the performance table. I've talked this through with a number of clients. We're still working with a number of different clients in the water industry and elsewhere. And these are the sort of things that people are talking about setting targets for. Operational costs we've talked about. Embodied and operational carbon. That's the big one if we're going to save the world. I don't think I've said it yet, but what I always say in this presentation is that I do believe in 10, maybe only 5 years' time, the people that are following us in our industry, they will look back on us and say, do you remember the bad old days when we used to have we had contracts and with just no mention of carbon? Can you believe it? That's what they're going to say in the future. So our industry, go on, please.
I've got quite an interesting question here that's just related to what you've just covered.
Yeah, please.
It says, are the climate change requirements stated in the specific location within the scope, or can they be hidden anywhere in numerous documents within the scope?
Okay, lovely question, brilliant question, which I haven't answered yet. According to the X29, they can be absolutely flipping anywhere in the scope. Right. Whether or not a client chooses to try and group them together within a separate part of the scope, I would recommend that you would try and do that. But having said that, as we know, if you've got a diverse project with a whole load of different parts, you might have climate change requirements relating to different parts of the scope. Whether you have that climate change, those climate change in separate bits of the scope relating to the separate parts of the works, or whether you choose to try them, pull them all together into one bit called climate change requirements, I don't care. It doesn't matter at all as far as the contract is concerned. It's just a question of trying to make things clear to the person bidding your job. Does that make sense? Is that a reasonable answer? I hope that's a sensible answer.
It does. We had a follow-up response to that was saying they were expecting there was a reasonable chance that the separately defined X29 climate change requirements are not consistent with the various work specifications.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. Yeah. And I know that writing scope is very difficult generally. Our industry is afflicted by signing up for documents with a poor scope. Adding in this extra stuff regarding climate change is going to require skilled people that basically know what they're doing.
That is, I mean, particularly relevant. Obviously you have, when you're going through a procurement process, you're looking at the documents, you're looking at the contract, what's in the scope, and then you have big teams trying to identify what they can or can't rely on in terms of making commitments for their proposals. but at the same time, they are reliant on those that are then going to adjudicate on those bids being able to pick the
Yeah,
bones out of.
absolutely. So as we said before, any procurement person doing a procurement process knows that typically the last document that gets written is the instructions to bidders, and a subset of the instructions to bidders must be the evaluation process, so that everybody knows firstly what they've got to submit for their bid, but again how that's going to be impacted. So the general rule, as most of you out there will know, is that if you ask the bidder for anything, then it should be included in some way in your evaluation. Otherwise, why are you asking for it? So if we are asking the bidder to make promises in our lovely performance table, we should be telling the contractor how much benefit they're going to get from making a bigger rather than a smaller promise. That's the basic story. But those targets, coming back to my presentation in this slide, those targets, as I've said, can be for absolutely anything. And on the slide here, I don't need to read it out. You've already read it. You've had it for 5 minutes. These are various things that people have said we think they ought to be trying to use X29 to incentivize for. One thing I haven't said yet is that I was part of the team that developed X29, and to be honest, I wanted the performance table to be in a completely separate option, because one of the problems with X29, it's called climate change. There's a parallel here. Every Saturday morning I do a park run. The park run has got a problem because it's called run, and the park run is trying to encourage people to walk as well. And it's the same thing here. X29 is called climate change, and it's harder for me and the rest of the world to get you out there to realize that these targets can be used for absolutely anything, as long as you can write them down and they're measurable. How are we going to structure the targets? Again, this is just me doing a little bit of thinking, and I did an MBA years ago, and everything's got to be a 2x2 matrix, isn't it? So these targets could be set by the client, or they could be set or offered by the bidder as part of their bid, as we've talked about through this presentation. And then logically, the left-hand side, they could relate to the end product, or they could relate to how the contractor provides the works. This is not a rule. This is just me giving you guys out there a space, a way of thinking about what sort of targets we want to include in our performance table. You might choose to structure your performance table in this way. I don't care, it doesn't matter, but it's just a way of thinking about the targets you want to use. I would say be careful about overlapping between climate change requirements and performance table. As we've mentioned before, we don't want to be slapping the contractor twice for what's essentially the same thing. Now, if you're interested in this, and I hope you are interested in this, be aware that my friend Francesco at NEC has an active working group on X29, trying to gather together case studies and to issue guidance to the world on how we can use X29 to do the sort of things that I've been talking about on this presentation. I'm one of, I think there's 15 or so people on that working group at the moment. If you're interested, drop Francesco an email and come and join the party.
Thank you, Richard. That's just answered one of the questions that was raised by Dennis about examples of case studies. I think the comment I would make at this stage is that we're in a multi-speed world when it comes to delivery of infrastructure, the nature of clients, the client's focus, the way they will actually adopt and embed the way that they work, the style of contracting that they do, which means that you have contractors having to work across a wide piece of different sort of approaches, and therefore their supply chain also has to align to this. So there's
absolutely
quite a lot of variability.
It's going to be difficult. Fundamentally, it's a change. We all love a change. Us consultants, we love a change because we can help people and we can make some money helping people with change. But what we are genuinely wanting to do is to make contracts better at, wait for it, saving the planet. That's what we're trying to do. We're all out there. This world is dying. We are killing it. Infrastructure is one of the biggest carbon producers of our society, and therefore I would argue, and I get enthusiastic and on my high horse, we should be thinking about ways that we can try and do this. When Mott MacDonald talks to our clients around the country, nearly every client, nearly every local council has got somebody with climate change in their job title. So everybody's thinking about this. X29 gives us an opportunity to actually do something about it. So I finish up here with, so far enough, all that stuff is all lovely. It's all fairly simple. Like I said, it's never going to be a hard presentation, but how are we going to use this to actually help clients with climate change, net zero, social value, BNG? Presentation again, another one we did on specifically on how to drive climate change. I did that with another colleague who's into as a real carbon specialist. And that's all we've got time for. Now, I don't know what time that is. It's only about half an hour, isn't it? I don't know. No, 48. I've done fairly well. Any questions from anybody, please share them. I can go back to Teams and I can see if I can see any questions now. Please be happy to fire more stuff on the chat if we have anything. Have we got any examples of case studies? So the problem is that there are very few people sharing case studies yet, despite my little bit I mentioned there about the climate change requirement can actually require people to share stuff. So that's a really big question. As I mentioned, the presentation I will share with you that was done by this guy from Skanska, that was a really good example. He did say that it had affected mindset and affected people and got people to start thinking about the issues in the performance table. But there are still very, very few clients doing it for real.
We have a live question, Jim McCluskey, if you'd like to put your microphone on and ask.
Please do chip in.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Very good. I remember when these options came out and were rolled out. I think Ian Heafy was part of it as yourself. Can you, given the pressure on climate change and there's obviously the summit going on at the moment, and lots of our clients are now looking at it in more detail and focusing on it. Do you think that the optional clause should now change to mandatory as part of NEC, and if so,
I work for Mott MacDonald, I don't work for NEC, but I know NEC fairly well. I've been working with NEC for 25 years now. They will never mandate it. I don't think it's right for a person that sells words, that sells form a contract, to mandate people what they're going to do with it. So just like NEC can't stop people bastardizing the contract like they love to do, which is a separate question for a separate day, they're never going to mandate X29. It's not up to NEC to mandate it. It's up to client organizations that are getting together to recommend it being used. And because, as I mentioned, particularly if we start paying for less carbon, then the most likely people to do that are likely to be government. One thing I haven't mentioned in my presentation is that in government, I hope you're all aware that every government department these days has got not only a pounds, shillings and pence budget, does that show my age or what? They've got not only a financial budget, but they've also got a carbon budget. So gradually government is starting to take carbon seriously. But that mandation, or it's very, very unlikely to. I mean, we haven't even mandated people to use NEC yet. They're still using a whole load of other contracts. I'll just say that rather than say anything nasty about those other contracts. They're still using other contracts. So the idea of mandating X29, I'm sorry, that's never going to happen.
Okay. Do we have any other questions that people would...
That's what I mean, though. If you don't do it on the daily brief.
Hi there.
Sorry, I think that's a bit of random chatter going on. Have you got any questions, please?
Yeah, Navdeep Singh, you have a question?
Hi, I've got a quick question. Is there a mechanism to adopt this on existing contracts? Would it be by, clause 60.1, the compensation, or PM's instruction for 14.3?
No, there's no way a PM could just add this stuff in. If a client wants to add it in, that would need to be via an addendum. And the one thing I would say is that we're in the the AMP process in the water industry and various other control periods around other industries, if a client has set up a framework, normally the framework sets up which options the client might want to use or might be able to use for the call-off contracts. If clients haven't included X29 in that framework, it would be a one-page addendum to the framework to allow people at a contract level, the call-off level, to use X29. And that obviously I would think is a good idea. Otherwise, we're going to miss 5 years of the opportunity to use X29.
Okay, so you
Does that
don't
answer your
think
question?
yeah, so we don't think it's a major change, and you reckon a one-page addendum can be
Oh, I mean,
included?
in terms of a framework, all it would need to say, we need to see an addendum to say that X29 is allowed to be called into the call-off contract. Most frameworks, or many frameworks, list the options that are going to be used in the call-off contract, or the options that are available to be used. All I'm saying is that those frameworks, if they're being issued now, they ought to at least give the opportunity for the staff to use X29 in subsequent call-off contracts. If that's not there already, then that could be done by a simple addendum.
Okay, so
Okay.
understanding that, so it can't be used on existing contracts, existing schemes then?
You can't just, I mean, particularly if you're looking at payment and extra things like that, you can't just instruct that into a contract. That would have to be agreed by an addendum between the parties.
Okay, that's clear.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks
No
for that.
problem. Good question. Thank you.
We have another question in the chat, Richard, and it is from James Ringrose, and it says, "Good afternoon. Many thanks for the presentation. We have recently entered into a contract which has an X29 performance table, but it does not set out the adjustment to the payment if a measured performance is higher, the same, or the lower than its target. Assume that in this case, penalty or incentive would not apply."
You're right to assume that. If there's no clear slap or tickle in Richard Patterson language, then there is no slap or tickle. So no problem. And as I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned, some clients will want to do exactly that. Let's get the performance table included in the contract. Let's get people used to the concept of measuring these things. Once we've proven that we can measure them, then maybe next time we'll start talking about bonuses and damages, slaps and tickles. Okay.
I think
Makes
that there
sense.
is a lot about manoeuvring the industry to be able to sort of transition into this way of working.
It's very definitely is that. And like I said, David, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this today. Like I said, I am oddly passionate about NEC. Anybody that knows me will know that I'm an NEC sad git, but I'm also passionate particularly about X29, not just because I outright it, but because it's just trying to do the right thing.
Well, I'm going to do a last call for any questions, because there's none obvious at the moment. If anyone else has got anything they would like to ask while Richard is here, as I say, Richard is a font of all knowledge when it comes to this, but he's doing a great job in trying to move things forward in terms of climate change and the way we work in our industry. I know that CECA is aligned to helping move sustainability initiatives on and helping our members and the wider industry actually work better together and achieving that. So if you've got any last questions for Richard, please speak up now.
One thing we haven't said is we'll share the slides. Obviously, there was a question about a particular link. I'll test that link in my presentation before we send it out. David, give us a chance to look at that tonight.
Okay, I'm seeing nothing else here at the moment. So what I would like to do, Richard, is thank you for your time, taking time out of a very busy schedule on a very busy day. For all of those you've got in the back room looking in as well, thank you for their patience as well. And obviously to Mott MacDonald for letting us share your expertise. I'm sure we will catch up again shortly. We've got other things that we should be looking at, and we will connect again moving forward. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone.
No problem. Thank you all. Thank you all for attending and taking an hour out of your day. I hope it was of some use.
And
okay.
The one last thing is, if there are any follow-up points that come to you while you're sat there having your cup of tea later, send them in. We may be able to respond and get something out to you. But or there is one last one. One hand going up there. I've lost the hand. Whoever it was, did you want to just?
There's lots of people disappearing.
Okay then. Well, thank you very much, Richard. I will say farewell for now, and we'll move on.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon.
Okay then. Thank you. Bye. Thank you to everyone for coming along. Hope you enjoyed it.